Every year, more than 1.5 million people step off cruise ships onto the docks of Charlotte Amalie, and for a few hours, they see St. Thomas the way a brochure wants them to. Duty-free jewelry stores, a gondola ride up to Paradise Point, a rum punch before the horn sounds, and it's time to reboard. They photograph turquoise water from a taxi window and call it paradise. And in a very real sense, they're not wrong. But few ever see the cistern on the roof that a family checks every morning, wondering if it will last until the next rain. Few see a nurse driving 45 minutes for an errand that would take 10 minutes on the mainland, because the island's roads were never built for the traffic it now carries. And few see a grandmother raising her grandchildren alone because her own children left for Florida or Georgia the year after high school, chasing wages the island itself can't pay. This is St. Thomas, United States Virgin Islands, one of the most visited destinations in the Caribbean and one of the most quietly strained, caught between being an American paradise for outsiders and an increasingly difficult place to build a life for the people who actually live there. From the air, St. Thomas tells two stories at once. Along the southern harbor, the geometry is unmistakably built for visitors. The long white hulls of cruise ships nosed against the haven site and Crown Bay piers, the shopping arcades unlocking their gates before 8 in the morning, taxi vans lining up in the heat to ferry people to Magens Bay or Coral World. A few streets back and a few hundred feet up the hillside, the picture changes. Small concrete block homes stack against Crown Mountain's slopes, water tanks and solar panels bolted to corrugated roofs, laundry drying on lines strung between houses that have weathered more than one hurricane. Down in that same ordinary morning, a mother is getting kids into uniforms for school. A mechanic is opening his shop before the day gets too hot to work outdoors, and none of it will make it into a single tourist's photograph. The 2020 census counted 42,261 people living on St. Thomas, a drop of roughly 9,400 residents, about 18%, from the 51,634 counted just a decade earlier in 2010. Across the territory as a whole, the population fell from 106,405 to 87,146, one of the sharpest 10-year population declines recorded anywhere in the United States. So what is pulling people away from a place millions of others pay good money to visit? Why do young Virgin Islanders leave almost as soon as they're able to? Why does an island this beautiful struggle to keep its own hospitals staffed, its water flowing, and its housing affordable? And if it's this hard, why does anyone stay at all? A visitor sees St. Thomas as an escape from ordinary life. For the people who live here, it simply is ordinary life, with all the plumbing problems, school runs, and grocery bills that implies. St. Thomas is part of the United States Virgin Islands, an unincorporated territory of the United States. People born here are United States citizens by birth. A status Congress extended to Virgin Islanders in 1927, a decade after the US purchased the islands from Denmark. But that citizenship comes with real asterisks. Residents of the territory cannot vote for President of the United States while living on the islands, and they have no voting representation in the US Senate or House, only a single non-voting delegate who can debate and sit on committees but cannot cast a final vote on the House floor. Local government, meanwhile, runs its own show: an elected governor, a 15-member unicameral legislature, and a local court system, all operating under a framework called the Revised Organic Act. Virgin Islanders serve in the US military at some of the highest per capita rates of any American population, and they pay federal taxes into their own territorial treasury rather than the US Treasury. It's a strange in-between status. American enough to bleed for the flag, not American enough to help pick who commands it. The island wakes up early. Along the waterfront in Charlotte Amalie, shopkeepers roll up metal grates around 7, sweeping sidewalks that will fill with cruise passengers by mid-morning. Down at Red Hook, on the island's east end, the Vitran buses and the shared taxis, open-air vans called safaris with bench seating in the back, start their loops, carrying hotel and restaurant staff towards Charlotte Amalie and the resort strip. The Red Hook ferry dock is already busy too, since this is the crossing point to St. John, and plenty of St. Thomas residents work jobs on the neighboring island and commute by boat the way someone else might take a bridge. Fishermen bring in yellowtail snapper and conch at small landings before the heat sets in. By 8, Main Street in Charlotte Amalie is a mix of two economies operating side by side, locals grabbing coffee and pâtés on their way to government or retail jobs, and the first wave of cruise passengers wandering past jewelry stores that only open because the ships are in port that day. The island's neighborhoods each carry their own character. Charlotte Amalie itself, the territorial capital and largest settlement, holds the historic downtown along with hillside residential areas like Savan and Garden Street, dense, older communities where houses sit close enough that neighbors know each other's business. And each other's business is often exactly what keeps a family afloat during a hard month. Frenchtown, just west of downtown, was settled by French-speaking fishing families who arrived from Saint Barthélemy generations ago, and it still carries that Creole cottage character and its own French heritage museum. Tutu, more inland and modern, functions as the island's commercial hub, home to its largest shopping centers and a lot of newer housing. Red Hook and the East End have a different rhythm again, more spread out, more residential, closer to the water and the ferries. Living this close together in a territory this small comes with real trade-offs, an intense, dependable safety net where a sick neighbor gets meals dropped off without being asked, but very little privacy since everyone eventually knows everyone else's situation. Multi-generational households are the norm rather than the exception. It's common for grandparents, parents, and children to share one roof, partly out of tradition and partly out of housing costs. Sunday itself is sacred in its own low-key way. Church in the morning, then a big midday meal, dominoes or cards on a porch, kids running between yards that don't really have fences separating them. Here's the real dilemma a lot of Virgin Islanders quietly wrestle with, and it's worth sitting with for a second. Stay on an island where you know everyone, where your grandmother's neighbor will feed your kids if you're running late, but where wages are lower and opportunities are limited, or leave for the mainland, where the paycheck is bigger and the career ladder is longer, but where nobody's checking on your mother because they don't know her. If you were choosing, which would matter more to you? The tight community or the wider opportunity? That tension, more than any single hardship, is the quiet engine driving a lot of the island's population loss. Food on St. Thomas tells the story of who has passed through and stayed. The base of it is West African and Danish influenced, layered with British, French, and more recently, Puerto Rican and Dominican influence. The unofficial national dish is fish and fungi. Fresh local fish, often snapper, served alongside fungi. A cornmeal and okra side dish descended from rations enslaved cooks were once given and transformed into something genuinely their own. Kallaloo is a dense, leafy stew with okra, crab, and sometimes salted meat closer in spirit to gumbo than to anything called a salad. Johnny cake, a fried cornmeal flatbread, shows up at breakfast, at carnival, at nearly every family gathering. Pats, savory, hand-folded pastries filled with beef, chicken, or salt fish, function the way a hot dog or a slice of pizza might elsewhere. A grab-and-go staple sold from roadside stands. Stewed goat and curried chicken lean into the island's British and Indian Caribbean threads. Conch, fried into fritters or stewed, remains a staple pulled straight from the surrounding reefs. And Mauby, a fermented bittersweet drink brewed from tree bark, is a flavor visitors either love immediately or can't get past, but that locals grew up on. Almost none of these recipes exist as a written-down standard. They're passed down by watching a grandmother's hands, by taste and instinct, adjusted a little in every household. That oral tradition sits in real tension with the island's dependence on imported food. The vast majority of what's on a St. Thomas grocery shelf arrives by container ship from the mainland or Puerto Rico, meaning even the most traditional home-cooked meal is quietly subsidized by a supply chain a single bad storm can disrupt. Nature on St. Thomas isn't scenery, it's infrastructure. Magens Bay, routinely ranked among the most beautiful beaches in the world, is where tourists go for a photo, and where locals go for a Sunday swim they don't have to pay admission to think twice about. Coki Beach and the reefs around Coral World function as the island's snorkeling and dive economy, employing boat captains, instructors, and gear rental staff. Crown Mountain, the island's highest point at 1,555 feet, still shapes where people can build and how water drains during a storm. The waters around St. Thomas and the outlying cays, Water Island, Hassel Island, Thatch Cay, support both a small commercial fishing fleet that supplies the island's fish markets and a much larger tourism workforce built around boat charters and water sports. For a fisherman heading out from a small landing before sunrise, the sea is a job. For the passengers on a catamaran a few hours later, it's the whole reason they came. Charlotte Amalie's historic core holds some of the oldest continuously used buildings in the Western Hemisphere, and each one carries a specific, verifiable history. Fort Christian, built by the Danes starting around 1672 and expanded over the following 2 centuries, is the oldest standing structure on the island, a fort, a governor's residence, a jail, and today a museum, with a red brick Victorian clock tower added in 1874. Across from it sits Emancipation Garden, the small park where enslaved islanders gathered in 1848 to hear the proclamation that ended slavery in the Danish West Indies. It still holds a replica of Philadelphia's Liberty Bell and a bronze statue of a freedman blowing a conch shell as a call to freedom. Up the hill, the 99 steps, built from bricks that arrived as ballast in the holds of Danish sailing ships, climb toward Blackbeard's castle, a watchtower built in 1679 and originally named Skitsborg, meaning protection castle. It's a genuinely surprising detail that the steps, despite the name, actually number 103. Nobody is entirely sure how the shorter name stuck. The St. Thomas Synagogue traces its congregation to the late 1600s and completed its current sand-floored sanctuary in 1833, one of the oldest continuously used synagogues under the American flag. And in Frenchtown, the French Heritage Museum preserves the story of the Huguenot and Saint Barthélemy fishing families who settled that neighborhood generations ago. The natural world that draws all those visitors is under real, documented stress. Since 2020, reefs around St. Thomas and St. John have been hit by stony coral tissue loss disease, an aggressive and still not fully understood illness that can kill a coral colony within weeks and has already devastated reefs across the wider Caribbean. Marine researchers monitoring these waters have also tracked a troubling rise in turf algae and an invasive alga called Ramicrusta taking over reef surfaces once occupied by living coral. Layered on top of disease is the lingering damage from the two Category 5 hurricanes that struck in September 2017, Irma and Maria, which passed close enough to fragment and dislodge coral colonies even where they didn't flatten them outright. None of this is abstract for the island's economy. NOAA researchers have estimated that healthy coral reefs around the U.S. Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico provide well over $200 million a year in coastal protection value alone, buffering the shoreline from the very storms that keep getting stronger. The deepest roots of St. Thomas's population trace back to enslaved West and Central Africans brought here under Danish rule, whose descendants make up the majority of the island's black population today, layered over generations with Danish, French Huguenot, Sephardic Jewish, and more recently, Puerto Rican, Dominican, and Eastern Caribbean immigrant communities. That layered history shows up loudest every April, when St. Thomas Carnival takes over Charlotte Amalie, a tradition reintroduced in 1952 that now fills the streets with Jouvert pre-dawn parades, Moko Jumbies dancing on 6-foot stilts, and the Carnival Village, where the food fair sells fried johnny cake and kallaloo stew to a soundtrack of calypso, soca, reggae, and quelby. Quelby, sometimes called scratch band music, is the territory's own homegrown genre, built around banjo, ukulele, squash, and improvised percussion, with roots reaching back through enslaved and free Afro-Caribbean musical traditions on the plantations. Most residents speak English, but Virgin Islands Creole, sometimes called Crucian in its St. Croix form, is its own legitimate linguistic system, with roots in the plantation era, not a broken version of English, and it still carries the rhythm of everyday conversation on porches and in markets. Faith runs deep and varied. Moravian and Anglican congregations trace back to the earliest colonial missions to enslaved communities, Catholic parishes anchor several neighborhoods, and the St. Thomas Synagogue anchors a small but historically significant Jewish community that has been present on the island since the 1600s. The written history moves in clear, documented stages. Before European contact, the islands were inhabited by Taino and later Kalinago, or Carib, peoples, whose populations were devastated within a few generations of Spanish arrival following Columbus's landing in the region in 1493. Danish colonization began in earnest on St. Thomas in the 1660s and expanded to St. John and St. Croix over the following century, building an economy on sugar, rum, and the forced labor of enslaved Africans, a system that must be named plainly rather than softened, since the wealth built by Danish planters came directly from generations of stolen human labor. Resistance built for decades before enslaved people on St. Croix forced the issue in 1848. Facing an uprising, Danish governor Peter von Scholten declared immediate emancipation rather than the gradual freedom Denmark had originally planned. Labor conditions remained harsh even after emancipation, and in 1878, a major labor uprising on St. Croix, remembered as the Fire Burn, and led in part by women remembered today as the Three Queens, Mary, Agnes, and Matilda, burned plantations and forced further reforms. By the early 20th century, Denmark's Caribbean colony was running at a financial loss, and as World War I raised American fears that Germany might seize a foothold in the Caribbean, the United States pressured Denmark to sell. On March 31, 1917, the transfer became official. The US paid Denmark $25 million in gold coin for the islands, and the Danish West Indies became the United States Virgin Islands, an event still commemorated every year as Transfer Day. The islanders themselves had no vote in that transaction. A decade later, in 1927, Congress extended U.S. citizenship to Virgin Islanders, and after years of activism against U.S. Navy rule, Congress passed the Organic Act of 1936, establishing real local self-government. Later expanded under the revised Organic Act of 1954, which still forms the legal basis for the territory's government today. The economy that emerged from all this history now runs overwhelmingly on tourism, both the cruise ship day trip economy and longer stay hotel and villa tourism, supplemented by government employment, retail, and a smaller but steady maritime and marine services sector, built around yacht charters and boat repair. As of 2023, the estimated median household income across the U.S. Virgin Islands stood at roughly $40,400, noticeably below comparable mainland figures, even as the cost of imported goods, fuel, and housing runs high. Because the territory produces almost none of its own food, fuel, or building materials, nearly everything has to come in by ship, which means prices for basics track shipping costs and global fuel prices more closely than they do local wages. The tourism economy is also sharply seasonal, busiest in the winter high season and noticeably quieter, with fewer hours and less income for service workers during the slower summer and early fall months, right in the heart of hurricane season. And the territory's most recent major economic shock is impossible to overstate. The back-to-back Category 5 hurricanes of September 2017, Irma and Maria, which damaged homes, hospitals, and hotels across the island, and triggered years of rebuilding, and a documented wave of out-migration in their aftermath. Housing has become one of the sharpest daily pressures on the island. Real estate data for the territory put the 2023 median home price at roughly $291,000, a figure that, measured against local wages, puts home ownership out of reach for a large share of working Virgin Islanders. Prices run high for straightforward reasons. Nearly every piece of lumber, tile, wiring, and appliance has to be shipped in. Land on a small mountainous island is genuinely scarce, and short-term vacation rentals compete directly with local families for the same limited housing stock, often winning that competition because a week of tourist rental income can outpace a month of local rent. There's a particular quiet irony that plenty of islanders live with. The same people cleaning villas, maintaining pools, and driving the golf carts at luxury resorts often can't afford to live anywhere near the properties they spend their working lives maintaining. Infrastructure here runs on improvisation as much as on any grid. Much of the island's water still comes from rain collected in private cisterns built into or beneath homes, a system dating back to the Danish era. Though a desalination and municipal distribution system run by the territory's water authority supplements it, particularly in denser areas. Electricity comes from the Virgin Islands Water and Power Authority, a grid that residents will tell you, matter-of-factly, is prone to outages, enough that generators and battery backups are common household investments, not luxuries. Roads twist tightly around Crown Mountain's slopes, narrow, steep, and often just 2 lanes, so what looks like a short distance on a map can take 20 or 30 minutes to actually drive. And in a detail that surprises a lot of first-time visitors, Virgin Islanders drive on the left side of the road while using American left-hand drive vehicles, a leftover quirk from British colonial-era traffic patterns that never got changed after the US took over. Hurricane season, running roughly from June through November, shapes the emotional calendar of the island as much as any holiday does. Residents watch tropical forecasts obsessively during those months, stock up on water, batteries, and canned food each time a storm enters the Atlantic, and know from hard experience what a direct hit can mean. Hurricanes Irma and Maria, both Category 5 storms that struck in September 2017 within about 2 weeks of each other, remain the reference point for every conversation about storm preparedness on the island. Homes lost roofs. The territory's hospitals were damaged badly enough that patients had to be evacuated, and full recovery took years, not months. The territory's median age reached 45.9 years in the 2020 census, the oldest median age recorded in any U.S. state or territory that year, a number that reflects not longer lifespans so much as a steady exodus of the young. Education and career opportunity are the two forces that pull young Virgin Islanders away most consistently. Many leave for college on the mainland and simply never move back, since St. Thomas offers limited options in fields like advanced medicine, engineering, or corporate law. Florida, Georgia, and the New York metro area are the most common landing spots, chosen partly for job markets and partly because earlier generations of Virgin Islanders already built communities there. The emotional cost of that shrinking younger population shows up in quieter ways than any statistic can capture. Schools that have consolidated as enrollment dropped. Church pews with more gray hair than they used to have. Grandparents raising grandchildren because parents had to leave for work. Every hardship named here is real. The outages, the cisterns, the wages that don't stretch as far as they should, the friends and children who leave and don't come back, the reefs dying a little more every year. None of it is exaggerated for effect, and yet people stay, and more than that, people who leave often spend years trying to find a way back. What holds them isn't abstract. It's the smell of fungi and fresh snapper on a Sunday afternoon, the sound of a Quelby band tuning up before carnival, the particular blue of the water at Magens Bay at 7 in the morning before anyone else is on the sand, the ease of a porch conversation with a neighbor who's known you since you were born, the low hum of a steel pan practicing somewhere down the hill, the taste of a warm Johnny cake split open with your thumbs, and the simple, specific comfort of a small island where, whatever else goes wrong, someone always knows your name. By late afternoon, the cruise ships pull their gangways in, one by one, and the horns sound as they ease back out past Hassel Island toward open water, carrying with them a version of St. Thomas that never really existed in the first place. A place with no cisterns, no power outages, no grandchildren waiting for a phone call from Florida. Down in Charlotte Amalie, the shopkeepers lock their grates, and up the hillside, dinner starts, the way it does every night, whether or not a single tourist ever saw it happen. Paradise, on this island, was never the absence of hardship. It was always just people choosing again and again to stay close to each other anyway. St. Thomas is not the postcard the ships leave behind. It's a living American community. Citizens without a presidential vote, built on African resilience and Danish brick, holding on to itself through hurricanes, disease-stricken reefs, and a housing market it can barely afford. Because the alternative, for most Virgin Islanders, has simply never felt like home. If this look behind the beaches and the duty-free shops meant something to you, subscribe for more honest stories about the real people living inside the world's postcards, the communities holding on behind the vacation photos. Like this video if you want more of the real Caribbean, not just the cruise ship version of it. Which place should we cover next? Drop your answer in the comments. We're always looking for the next island, city or town that deserves a closer, more honest look.